Amira clutched her veil as she watched her in-laws laugh at her father, whispering, "Such a poor old man." Her chest tightened. They didn't know that the man they mocked had quietly built an empire far beyond their imagination. Amira walked slowly down the aisle, trying to keep her smile steady, but inside her heart was shaking. She held her father's arm tightly. Dakari looked nervous but proud, his old suit a little too big, the fabric faded from years of careful use. He had worn it for every important moment of her life, and today was the biggest of all. Amira loved him deeply for showing up just as he was. But the whispers started before they reached the front. One of Tay's aunts covered her mouth, laughing softly as she pointed at Dakari's shoes. Another uncle leaned back in his chair and said loudly, "Couldn't he afford something better?" A group of cousins snickered, calling him the poor old man. They didn't try to hide it. They didn't care who heard. To them, mocking him was entertainment. Amira felt a sharp pain in her chest. She kept walking, but every insult hit her like a stone. She could hear small giggles coming from different corners of the hall. Even some guests who didn't know her well began chuckling, thinking it was harmless fun. They assumed Dakari was just another struggling father trying to marry off his daughter into a richer family. They didn't know anything about him. They didn't know how many nights he stayed awake working, how many sacrifices he made, how many dreams he put aside so she could chase hers. Dakari pretended not to hear any of it. His smile trembled for a second, but he quickly straightened his face, trying to stay calm for his daughter's sake. He didn't want to ruin her day. Amira noticed that small shake in his hand, and it broke her heart more than the insults. She wished she could scream at everyone to stop, but she didn't want to cause a scene at her own wedding. Tay, her soon-to-be husband, stood at the altar, watching everything with confusion and discomfort. He looked from Amira to his family, not knowing what to say. He had never seen them behave like this before. Amira could tell he felt embarrassed, but he stayed silent, unsure how to react. As she reached the altar, Amira lifted her chin slightly, trying to appear calm, but deep inside she promised herself one thing. Today would not end with her father being humiliated. They thought they were laughing at a poor man. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Amira sat quietly beside Tay as the ceremony continued, her hands resting on her lap, her face calm like nothing had happened. But inside, her heart was heavy. She could still hear the whispers from earlier, still see the mocking smiles directed at her father. The pain was real, but she refused to let anger show on her face. She knew if she reacted, those same people would say she was dramatic or ungrateful. So she chose silence, not because she was weak, but because she was stronger than their insults. While the priest spoke, her eyes drifted to her father. Dakari sat in the front row, folding his hands gently, his expression steady even though she knew his feelings were hurt. She remembered all the sacrifices he made when she was young. She remembered him skipping meals just so she could have enough food for school. She remembered him waking up before sunrise every day to work, coming home late, still smiling at her even when his body was tired. She remembered him saving money little by little, refusing to buy anything for himself so she could have books, uniforms, and everything she needed. He had lived a life full of sacrifice, and yet today, people judged him only by his clothes. Amira took a slow breath and reminded herself that appearances can be deceiving. People saw an old suit, worn shoes, and a quiet man. They didn't see the empire he built without bragging. They didn't see the strength it took to rise from nothing. They didn't know his story. She felt proud of him, more proud than she had ever been. Instead of letting shame take over, she chose dignity. She lifted her chin slightly, showing a gentle confidence. She refused to let their mockery define the moment. She knew the truth, and the truth was powerful. She didn't need to fight with anyone or shout or defend him loudly. Her silence was stronger than their laughter. Some guests watching her noticed her calmness. They expected her to look embarrassed or angry, but she didn't. Instead, she held herself with grace, like someone who knew exactly who she was and where she came from. A few people whispered to each other, wondering why she wasn't reacting. They didn't know that her silence was not fear, it was strength. Amira kept reminding herself that one day, those same people would realize the mistake they made by judging too quickly. She didn't know exactly when that moment would come, but she knew it would. And when it did, they would finally see who her father truly was. At the reception, Amira tried her best to stay calm, But her heart tightened again when she noticed her father walking toward Tay's family. Dakari smiled kindly, trying to start a simple conversation. He asked how everyone was enjoying the day, and even complimented the decorations. He was just being friendly, the way he had always taught Amira to be. But instead of kindness, he received sharp looks and forced smiles. One aunt leaned toward another and said loudly, "Look at him trying so hard to fit in." Another uncle laughed and replied, "These poor old men always try to act important at weddings." They spoke as if Dakari wasn't standing right in front of them. Their words were coated in fake politeness but filled with disrespect. Dakari pretended not to notice. He nodded gently, still smiling, still trying to be polite. He didn't want to cause any trouble. He didn't want to spoil his daughter's special day. But Amira could see the slight drop in his shoulders, the tiny pause before he answered them. She could tell their words were cutting him deeper than he would ever admit. The mockery continued. One cousin said, "Sir, your suit looks very vintage," giving a smirk that wasn't friendly at all. Another added, "I guess you did your best, right?" as if dressing nicely was too big of a challenge for him. They laughed among themselves, pretending it was just harmless fun, but their eyes were full of judgment. Amira stood from her seat, gripping her dress tightly. She couldn't believe people could be so cruel on such a happy day. She watched her father whisper a quiet, "Excuse me," and step away from them, trying to hide the hurt on his face. It broke her heart more than anything else. Tay noticed everything. His expression changed from confusion to discomfort, then to shock. He had known his family could be loud and opinionated, but this was different. This was open disrespect. He looked at Amira, unsure what to say or how to react. His face showed guilt, embarrassment, and helplessness all at once. For a moment, the whole celebration felt ruined. Amira wanted to shout or defend her father, but she held herself still. She watched everyone around her laughing, eating, smiling, completely unaware of the pain they were causing. In that moment, one thing became clear to her. These people thought they had power because they believed her father was beneath them. They thought their wealth made them better. They thought they could treat him however they wanted. They had no idea how wrong they were. The laughter and whispers continued around the hall. Amira's mind drifted far away from the noise. In her heart, a memory opened like a quiet door. She saw her father not as the guests saw him today, but as the man he truly was. She remembered him in their small, old house years ago. The roof leaked during rainy nights, and sometimes they had only one meal a day. Yet Dakari always told her, "Tomorrow will be better." He never complained, even when life was hard. He worked many jobs. Carpenter during the day, security guard at night, and still found time to walk her to school every morning. There was a time she had begged for a new school bag because hers was torn. Dakari didn't have the money, but he stayed up all night stitching the bag by hand, so she wouldn't feel embarrassed in class. He always found a way to protect her, even when he had nothing. As she grew older, she started noticing the changes. Dakari began coming home with paperwork, notebooks filled with ideas, drawings, and business plans. He studied every night, teaching himself things he had never gone to school for. He saved every small amount he could earn, and slowly, quietly, he started his first tiny business selling handmade furniture. It wasn't easy. Some days he sold nothing. Some days he walked miles carrying chairs on his head because he couldn't afford transport. But he never stopped. He never gave up. Year after year, his small furniture business grew. He hired workers. He built a workshop. Then he bought land. Then another. Soon he invested in real estate. Then transportation. Then technology. But he kept everything private. He didn't dress rich. He didn't show off. He didn't tell people about his success. Instead, he used his wealth to send Amira to the best schools, pay for her training, her dreams, her future. And he never once told her how big his empire had grown because he didn't want her to feel pressure or pride. Amira blinked back at the present, her heart swelling. The people around her saw only a poor old man, in an old suit. They thought they were better than him. They had no idea the man they mocked owned more businesses than all of them combined. They had no idea the person they laughed at could buy the entire hall they were standing in. The irony was so sharp it almost hurt to breathe. They judged him by his appearance, not knowing he had climbed mountains none of them could ever survive. Amira watched her father quietly step away from the group that had mocked him, and something inside her hardened. She had hoped today would go smoothly, but she had also prepared herself, just in case things turned ugly. She knew her in-laws loved to judge people by their clothes, their cars, their status. She had seen their pride many times before. So she had made a plan, one her father didn't even know about. When Dakari looked her way, his eyes sad but calm, Amira gave him a small signal. It was just a gentle nod, a soft smile, the kind that said, "Don't worry. Everything is under control." Dakari understood immediately. He took a deep breath and relaxed his shoulders. He trusted her completely, just like he always had. Amira stood still, but her presence began to change. Her face softened into a calm confidence. She didn't look angry or hurt anymore. She looked ready, the kind of ready that made people around her feel something was coming, though they didn't know what. She moved with quiet strength. No loud words, no drama, just a deep certainty inside her that the time had come. She glanced around the hall, taking in every detail. The relatives laughing at her father. The guests pretending not to notice. Tay standing awkwardly, unsure where to look. Everyone thought she would stay silent forever. They thought she would let her father suffer because he looked poor. They had no idea how much she adored him, or how much she knew. Her calmness began to make some people uneasy. A few cousins whispered, wondering why she was so quiet when her father had just been insulted. Even Tay's mother looked confused, shifting in her seat, sensing that Amira was not as fragile as she assumed. Inside her heart, Amira repeated the plan she had created days before the wedding. She had gathered important documents. She had prepared a short announcement. She had arranged for something to be shown on the big screen if she needed it. She hoped she wouldn't, but now it felt necessary. Instead of breaking down, Amira let a small smile appear on her face. Not a happy smile, an intentional one. A smile that said, "I'm not done yet." She held her head high and stood with the grace of someone who already knew the ending of the story. The suspense in the room grew slowly. People didn't know what she was thinking, but they could see something shifting. The girl they mocked was no longer shrinking. She was rising. Amira inhaled deeply, ready. The moment she had prepared for was approaching, and soon, everyone would learn that the man they laughed at had more power than they could imagine, and that his daughter was far from helpless. Midway through the reception, when the music softened and most people were busy eating and laughing, Amira slowly stood up from her seat. At first, no one noticed her. But when she lifted the microphone with calm hands, the hall grew quiet little by little. People looked up, expecting a normal thank you speech. No one imagined what was coming. Amira smiled politely, her eyes moving around the room. She began by thanking everyone for coming. Her voice was soft but steady. Then she paused, letting the silence settle. That pause made everyone lean in a little. Something in her tone felt different, stronger, deeper. Even the relatives who had mocked her father earlier shifted uncomfortably, unsure why her smile felt so controlled. She took a breath and said, "Before we continue, there's something important I want to share about my father." Dakari's head snapped up. He hadn't expected her to say anything. He looked nervous, shaking his head slightly as if telling her she didn't need to do this. But Amira's eyes held a firmness that told him everything was under control. The mocking relatives sat straighter. Some smirked, thinking she was about to defend her father's poor appearance. They prepared themselves to enjoy it. But Amira's next sentence hit the room like a quiet explosion. "My father is the majority owner of several major companies you all know very well." The hall went completely still. Forks froze mid-air. A few gasps escaped. Someone in the back whispered, "What?" But everyone heard it. Amira continued, her voice calm and clear. She mentioned a well-known construction company. People's heads turned instantly. Everyone knew it. Then she mentioned a transportation company that many guests used regularly. Murmurs rose. She added a technology firm that had sponsored events in the same city. At that point, some people stood up in shock. Her in-laws stared at her, speechless. The color drained from Tay's mother's face. The uncle who had laughed earlier now swallowed hard, his eyes wide. One cousin looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Amira didn't raise her voice or brag. She only said the truth, simply and directly. He built everything quietly. He never needed to show off. But today, I cannot let anyone treat him with disrespect. Every eye in the hall turned to Dakari. The same man they mocked for his worn suit. Now they looked at him with disbelief, confusion, and sudden respect. People began whispering frantically, trying to connect the humble man in front of them to the powerful figure they had never known. The room was filled with shock, guilt, and silence so heavy it felt like the walls were listening. Amira had turned the entire wedding upside down with just a few calm sentences. The moment Amira finished speaking, all eyes moved to her in-laws. It was almost unbelievable how quickly the pride on their faces disappeared. Just minutes earlier, they were laughing loudly, acting superior, making rude comments about Dakari. Now their faces looked pale, almost frozen in place. No one needed to tell them. They knew they had just embarrassed themselves in front of everyone. Tay's mother was the first to react. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She forced a smile that didn't stay steady, trying to act as if she already knew this information. But the way her hands trembled on her lap showed the truth. She was shocked, confused, and completely unprepared. The uncle who had joked about Dakari's vintage suit looked like he had swallowed something sharp. He kept blinking fast, his eyes darting around the hall as if searching for an escape. One of the aunties pressed a hand to her chest, whispering, "Owner? Majority owner?" She repeated it like she couldn't accept it, but the crowd didn't give them space to hide. Whispering started immediately, spreading from table to table. People turned in their seats to look at the in-laws. Some covered their mouths in surprise. Others exchanged knowing looks as if saying, "They deserve this." And a few even smiled, enjoying the sudden shift in power. The same people who had laughed earlier were now embarrassed. They tried straightening their clothes, fixing their expressions, pretending they hadn't mocked Dakari at all. But the guests had heard everything. They had seen the insults. They remembered the rude jokes. And now they watched the in-laws struggle to act innocent. Tay stood frozen beside his mother. He glanced at Amira, then at her father, then back at his own family. He had no idea what to say. He finally understood how wrong they had been. His face softened with guilt, as if he wanted to apologize on behalf of everyone. The embarrassment in the in-laws' eyes was clear. They avoided Dakari's gaze completely, unable to look at the man they had disrespected. They had mocked his clothes, his background, his entire life, without knowing they were insulting someone far more successful than them. Some guests even pointed gently in their direction, whispering things like, "Imagine insulting a billionaire," and see how they were laughing before. Their earlier confidence vanished. Their smiles faded. Their voices disappeared. The arrogance they carried so proudly melted into silence. For the first time that day, it wasn't Dakari who felt small. It was them. As the in-laws sat frozen, the rest of the guests slowly began to realize what had just happened. At first, there was a stunned silence. People blinked, exchanged glances, and whispered under their breath. Then one brave guest clapped softly at first, and another joined in. Soon, the clapping grew louder, filling the hall with a wave of appreciation. It was not just polite applause. It was admiration, respect, and astonishment all at once. Some guests leaned toward each other, whispering in disbelief. "I never would have guessed," said one. "He looks so simple, yet he owns all those companies." Another shook their head, murmuring, "Appearances can be so deceiving." People who had been laughing earlier now felt a mixture of shame and awe, realizing how wrong they had been to judge someone by what they saw on the outside. Amira smiled quietly, feeling the shift in the room. She didn't need to raise her voice or demand attention. Her calm confidence and the truth about her father had done all the work. Guests were now seeing the real Dakari, the man who had built everything from nothing, quietly, with patience, hard work, and intelligence. Even the staff who were serving food paused for a moment, looking at Dakari with new respect. People began to approach him, shaking his hand, complimenting his success, and telling him how inspiring his journey was. One woman whispered to her friend, "What a humble man, and such a proud daughter." Amira noticed some of the younger guests watching closely. She could see the admiration in their eyes, the lesson quietly sinking in. It doesn't matter what someone wears or how they look. What matters is their heart, their effort, and their character. The laughter from earlier felt like a distant memory, replaced by an atmosphere charged with respect. The whispers grew into conversations about perseverance and humility. Guests discussed how someone could work in silence, save diligently, and achieve greatness without flaunting it. Some even compared themselves silently, reflecting on their own judgments and biases. The hall was alive with energy, but now it was an energy of inspiration rather than mockery. Amira took a deep breath and looked at her father. He stood tall, his quiet dignity shining brighter than any suit or jewelry could. The room had changed completely. Where there was once ridicule, now there was admiration. Where there had been scorn, now there was awe. The power of humility, intelligence, and perseverance had spoken louder than any insult ever could. For the first time that day, Dakari's worth was clear to everyone, and Amira's quiet strength had made sure it stayed that way. Amira stepped forward slowly, her smile calm and confident. She moved with grace, holding herself tall as if the weight of the world was nothing compared to the truth she now carried. The hall was quiet, all eyes on her. Even the guests who had been whispering in admiration fell silent, waiting to hear what she would say next. She turned toward her father, Dakari, and her eyes filled with warmth and love. "Thank you, Dad," she said softly, her voice carrying across the room. "Thank you for every sacrifice, for every sleepless night, for every time you put my dreams before your own. You have always worked in silence, never asking for praise, and yet you built everything with your own hands and heart." Her words were simple, but powerful. The guests felt the emotion in her voice, and the sincerity in her eyes. She wasn't bragging. She wasn't attacking anyone. She was simply speaking the truth, showing gratitude, and letting the world see the real Dakari. The man who had done so much quietly, without needing anyone's approval. The in-laws sat frozen, their faces still drained of color. They opened their mouths to speak, but no words came out. The confident smiles they had worn earlier were gone. The jokes, the mockery, the sense of superiority, they had nothing left to stand on. For the first time, they realized that their arrogance had blinded them, and now they had no way to recover their dignity in front of everyone. Amira turned slightly to face the guests, spreading her hands gently as if to include everyone in the lesson she wanted to share. "We should never judge someone by what we see on the outside," she said. "We should look at their character, their effort, and the love they carry. True success is not in showing off, but in working quietly with integrity and lifting others along the way." A soft murmur of agreement spread across the room. Some guests nodded, some whispered, "She's right," while others looked at Dakari with admiration shining in their eyes. Amira's message was clear. Respect is earned through humility, perseverance, and kindness, not wealth, appearances, or loud words. She looked back at her father, who now stood taller than ever, a proud smile on his face. Amira felt a deep satisfaction, not from revenge, but from justice, respect, and truth being recognized. The hall had transformed. Where there was mockery before, there was now admiration. Where there was arrogance, there was humility. And at the center of it all stood Amira, calm, graceful, and victorious, not just for herself, but for her father and for everyone watching. Learning what real respect and dignity truly meant. As the wedding came to an end, Dakari stood beside Amira, his posture proud and calm. He looked around the hall, his eyes meeting the faces of the guests who had mocked him earlier. There was no anger in him, only quiet dignity, and a sense of fulfillment. Amira stood next to him, her hand gently resting on his arm, smiling with a calm confidence that spoke louder than any words ever could. The guests watched in awe. They had just witnessed more than a wedding. They had seen a lesson in humility, perseverance, and respect. The father-daughter bond in front of them was unbreakable, stronger than money, stronger than judgment, stronger than ridicule. People whispered to each other, realizing that real strength and value are often hidden behind simple appearances. Amira's heart swelled as she looked at her father. She remembered the sacrifices, the nights he worked silently, the dreams he set aside just for her future. Today, she had shown the world his true worth, but in doing so, she had also shown her own. She understood now that proving someone's value wasn't about fighting or shouting. It was about patience, planning, and letting the truth reveal itself. She looked around the hall at everyone, especially the in-laws, who still sat in disbelief. But she didn't feel anger toward them. Their mockery had faded, replaced by a lesson they would never forget. Amira had not only defended her father, she had set an example of grace under pressure. She had commanded respect on her terms, and in doing so, she had redefined how people would see her forever. Dakari smiled down at her, a quiet pride shining in his eyes. No words were needed between them. Everything had been said through their actions and presence. The love, respect, and trust they shared were visible to everyone in the room. It was clear that nothing, no wealth, no insults, no arrogance, could ever break the bond they had built over years of sacrifice and care. As the music played softly and the guests began to leave, the feeling in the hall had completely changed. Where there had been ridicule, now there was admiration. Where there had been judgment, now there was understanding. Amira realized that today was not just about proving her father's worth. It was about showing the power of dignity, love, and strategy. She had secured her father's respect in the eyes of the world, but more importantly, she had secured her own future, one built on intelligence, grace, and the unshakable knowledge that true strength always rises above mockery.